The TV show Vikings restored the popularity of a man who may have never existed, Ragnar Lothbrok. Since the Middle Ages, the Danish king was incredibly famous. He and his sons defined the modern perception of Vikings. Ragnar was said to be extremely heroic, utterly murderously, and capable of extraordinary deeds. Allegedly, he was one of the first men to attack the British Isles. The name is fitting. Ragnar was the northern word for divinity. But did he really exist? Watch this video to the end to find out why Ragnar maybe was able to exist and yet not exist at the same time. As a little teaser, Anders Windroth put it aptly like this: nothing about Ragnar is ordinary. Anyone who has seen the show knows the basics of who Ragnar is supposed to have been. He was apparently a charismatic Danish king who lived in the 9th century. It was supposedly he who led the Viking army that sacked Paris in 845. He is also said to have spent several times on the British Isles and to have been married several times. The most famous marriage was not to Lagertha, who was particularly prominent in the series. This role fell to Asluk, whom Ragnar is said to have first met under the name Kraka, which meant crow. The Danish king is said to have died by being thrown into a pit full of poisonous snakes. We only know about Ragnar through his sagas. There's no other source mentioning him directly by name. These are the most important points you should know about the genre of sagas. There are many different types of sagas. This led to the problems of saga classification. As a genre, the sagas come closest to the novel. This, however, is not completely undisputed. The sagas were created to entertain, guide, and report on contemporary events. The written tradition started in the 13th century. Before that, the sagas were transmitted orally. Many sagas start extremely factual but change afterwards. Sagas in Old Norse language only existed in Iceland. Sagas can rarely be checked for accuracy by comparison with other sources. We can draw 3 central conclusions. First, the long period of oral transmissions is a huge problem for the credibility of the sagas. There's no way to track changes through time and space. We have to take this problem into account moving forward. Second, sagas are no relatives to chronicles or annals. They serve a completely different purpose. Third, sagas hold their main value as historical sources analyzing the literary, cultural achievements of the Scandinavian tribes. In any other case, we must proceed with, let's call it, healthy skepticism. Ragnar's sagas are a compilation of 3 different works: the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, the tale of Ragnar's sons, and the poem with his name, which I will not try to pronounce. You can see it on the screen. Some scholars added a few more works that touch Ragnar's family, but don't put it in the spotlights. Modern studies believe that Ragnar's sagas and the Völsunga saga were supposed to be together. In doing so, Ragnar's and Sigurd's stories are combined. The greatest heroes of Scandinavia should obviously be presented together. Like many others, Ragnar's sagas were first written in Iceland in the 13th century. Sagas in general are incredibly complex. Even the Icelandic authors had problems understanding them completely. They were repeatedly victims of misunderstandings. 2 well-known examples demonstrate the huge consequences of these misconceptions. Firstly, the Vikings never drank out of the skulls of the enemy. One poem was falsely translated. Secondly, the blood eagle, which was shown several times in the TV show Vikings, wasn't a method of execution during Ragnar's times. It was introduced in the 14th century. The original author didn't understand his material correctly. It described Ragnar drawing ravens on the back of his enemies. Today we believe that this image was meant as an announcement of the death of the particular person. It is not known why the author changed the raven to an eagle. Even historians who heavily rely on the sagas criticize their lack in credibility in portraying Ragnar. At this point, we should return to the elephant in the room. Did Ragnar exist at all? His persona has been artificially created and we cannot find him anywhere than in the sagas. Some authors are convinced that Ragnar lived and acted as he is described. His deeds were too important for his name not to be preserved, they argue. It is very unlikely that Ragnar's life happened as shown in the series. In the show, he was portrayed as the leader of the raid on Lindisfarne in 793. In fact, there is no known evidence that Ragnar was involved. This seems highly unlikely. If Ragnar did exist, he led the attack on Paris in 845 as mentioned. After the successful raid, Ragnar is said to have continued to be active. His career would then have lasted more than 70 years. Although this is not completely impossible, it seems unlikely. It cannot be ruled out that Ragnar existed, but it is not very probable. However, this does not contradict the idea presented at the beginning that his deeds were too important, which is why his name had to be preserved. That is because there is the possibility that more than one Ragnar existed. Maybe different Vikings have accomplished the deeds. The Skalds brought them together in one man to create the ideal king. This could explain why we don't know the number of his famous sons or their mothers for sure. It is possible that some were sons of the first Ragnar and some were descendants of the second, third, fourth and so on Ragnar. It would also explain why the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon sources report about men with a similar name to Ragnar but not the same. The mentioned Raginfrid, Reginberi and Raginarius could have been different kings that were merged into Ragnar. But would it be acceptable for the true king to be reduced like that? The answer is complicated. The Skalds were not allowed to tell about anything that was known to be false. The later compilers also were critical with their material. This would indicate that they had to use the true name. On the other hand, many sections of the sagas are definitely false, and we can assume that the contemporary people knew too. For example, Ragnar himself is portrayed as a skeptic. When Kraka reveals to him that she is in fact Asluk, he doesn't believe her and even uses the phrase "not to be believable." Later on, he changes his mind because his wife proves her supernatural abilities. But this is not important. The example highlights that the Scandinavians didn't immediately accept every story as true. How does this all fit together? Probably the entertaining character of the stories comes into play. The people and even the kings accepted that known deeds were given to one man instead of numerous men because that improved the story and it has also increased its educational value. When all great deeds were accomplished by the ideal leader, it is easier to follow his example than to be inspired by the model of normal humans with flaws. The Skalds had in all likelihood a certain amount of leeway how they could present their stories. The audience wanted to listen to the most entertaining, the most educating and the truest to life stories at the same time. Some compromises were inevitably to deliver the sagas in this way. In literature, this technique is known as alienation. We can only speculate that the kings may have felt honored to become a part of the ideal king. To conclude and to give my personal opinion, there was probably more than one Ragnar. Other scholars came to the same result, but this doesn't mean that the sagas are completely false. Especially a lot of the described customs should be reliable, since the listeners would have known if the scholars told completely false things. When we want to learn about Ragnar, we definitely can learn about a lot of things, how the Vikings lived.